Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, An Introduction to Evidence-Based Practice, a Librarian's Guide, Part 1 of a 3-part series, Introduction to Evidence-Based Practice in PICO. My name's Tony Gwen, Executive Director for the Southeastern Atlantic region. Before we begin today's session, I will share a few administrative things. Please use the chat box to share ideas, communicate, and ask questions. Be sure to send to all participants so that our guest presenters, library colleagues, and I can see your questions and information shared. Our presenters inform me that your questions will be answered at the end of their presentation. However, please enter them as you think of them and into the chat box. I'll collect the questions and will pose them at the end of the presentation. If you need closed captioning for today's webinar, I will share the link in the chat box. Joining us today is Emily Brennan and Amanda Davis. Emily is a research informationist at the Medical University of South Carolina Library and liaison to the College of Medicine students and faculty, as well as hospital nurses and residents. As a member of the hospital's Value Institute, she teaches evidence-based practice courses for clinicians and also provides literature for hospital guidelines, evidence briefs, and clinical decision support tools. Amanda is a senior evidence-based practice analyst with the Value Institute at the Medical University of South Carolina. She promotes evidence-based practice through the facilitation of hospital guideline development, which includes critically appraising research using the GRADE criteria, developing evidence-based clinical decision support tools for transition into the electronic medical record. She also supports EBP education for clinical staff, residents, and dietetic interns. Amanda has 10 years of research experience and 13 years of clinical experience as a registered dietitian. Everyone, please welcome Emily and Amanda. Emily, I can't hear you.
Sorry, okay. Here we are. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for attending this webinar. So this is the first webinar in a 3-part series on evidence-based practice. I'm Emily Brennan. I'm the Research and Education Informationist at the MUSC Libraries.
And I'm Amanda Davis. I'm the Senior Evidence-Based Practice Analyst with the Value Institute.
So we work collaboratively together. Within the library, I work in the Research and Education Services Department. We provide educational research and clinical support for students, staff, and faculty. And then the Value Institute is actually physically housed within the library, and it includes an informatics component, and then with Amanda, she leads up the evidence-based practice component of the Value Institute. It falls under the hospital's Quality Management Department, and Amanda and I work together in providing education, evidence synthesis services, and the development of clinical decision support tools for faculty here at MUSC. So after completing the session, we expect that you will all be able to explain the importance and steps of evidence-based practice, identify the role of the librarian in teaching, practicing, and supporting evidence-based practice, and also formulate a clinical question based on the scope of the requester's problem, PICO, and question type. So now I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, who will talk about the evolution and importance of evidence-based practice.
Thank you, Emily. Though it may feel like it, evidence-based decision-making isn't new. It actually has been going on for centuries because humans have been trying to figure out how to prevent and treat disease and prevent poor health for centuries. One of the first clinical trials was actually in biblical times. It was a 10-day trial of 2 different diets in healthy children. The Babylonians were fed from the king's table. They primarily were eating meat and drinking wine. The Israelite children were eating beans, peas, and lentils and drinking water. They used the 10-day trial to determine which was the healthier diet and found at the end of the 10 days that the Israelites were considered, quote unquote, fairer and fatter And so therefore, the king of Babylon decided that the Babylonian children should also consume peas, beans, and lentils. If we fast forward to the mid-18th century, that was when Dr. James Lind did his research on treating scurvy in sailors at sea. He noticed that when he looked at what was written about the disease, it was written by sailors who were not doctors or by doctors who'd never been at sea. So he decided that he was going to do a trial where he tested 6 different treatments and had 2 sailors in each of the 6 groups while on a sea voyage. During the study, they did find that lemons and oranges were the best treatment for scurvy, but it took many years before they realized that it was related to vitamin C. As we take another step forward, we look more at modern times, and an Institute of Medicine report that came out in 2001 called Crossing the Quality Chasm. Essentially what the report did was found that there was a big difference between current clinical practices and optimal care. And they found that those practices that were currently driving that were decisions based on training and clinical intuition, which created unsupported variation and really involved little patient feedback. And so what they called for as a part of this way to cross the bridge between current clinical practices and optimal care was using evidence-based practice. So evidence-based practice, what is that? Evidence-based practice was started in the early 1990s from an evidence-based medicine perspective with Dr. Gordon Guyatt, and an evidence-based practice perspective a few years later with Dave Sackett and colleagues. And what it is, it's really a methodology to integrate best research evidence, clinical expertise, and patient values and preferences when making medical decisions. When you think of the evolution of evidence-based practice, you really have to look at it in 3 main steps. The first step of the process really is what kicked off that IOM report, and it was when they realized that most medical decisions were made most importantly based on clinical expertise. And clinical expertise can also be described as clinical gestalt and empiric therapy. And essentially what that is when decisions are made based on clinical training and the things that they have learned throughout their process of working as a clinician. And as you can imagine, it is involved with being able to notice patterns based on patient presentation and clinical signs and symptoms to help drive decisions with patient care. And what they realized in the 70s and 80s and started to formalize in the 90s was that clinical expertise, while important, needed additional information at the table kind of to round out those decisions. And that's really the point at which the hierarchy of evidence kind of came into play. And with the hierarchy of evidence, this is kind of when the methodologies and the ideas from Dr. Guyatt and Dr. Sackett kind of got formalized into a tool that was considered the hierarchy of evidence. This started really to kind of drive decision-making for individual clinicians in their individual needs with patients, and it really did kind of start the process of an EBP explosion. And essentially what happened in the 90s and 2000s was that evidence-based practices and the tenets of evidence-based practices started to show up quite a bit in the medical literature. And as you can see here, starting in 1997, that's when the first PubMed mesh heading was created for evidence-based resources. And in 1997, it started as evidence-based medicine. And as you can see, by 2009, it expanded to the point where they had specialized into evidence-based nursing, evidence-based dentistry, evidence-based emergency medicine, and then evidence-based practice in its more interprofessional, highly inclusive term. And as this process of exploding evidence occurred and more specialties were taking up the idea of evidence-based practice, it also became important for outside associations that were involved in the process, like the Medical Library Association, to create competencies to improve the ability to be a good resource as part of evidence-based practice. Now, to take a step back and look at the hierarchy of evidence a little more closely, what you see here is the initial hierarchy of evidence that came out of evidence-based medicine in the late 90s. And as you can see, it really focuses on primary literature. You have RCTs at the top as high-level literature, and all the observational and non-human studies all considered low-level literature. And the reason this was built this way is because the initial thought was that controlled studies were always going to be more trustworthy than observational studies. However, as evidence-based practice was picked up by more and more specialties, the hierarchy of evidence evolved as well. As you can see here, well-designed RCTs still play a big role, but systematic review and meta-analyses are at the top of all of these hierarchies. The one at the top on the left is one that's more specific to nursing. The one at the bottom is more specific to policy. And then you see the one on the right, which is really kind of all-encompassing of the current view of the hierarchy of evidence. So it incorporates your primary studies, randomized controlled trials, observational studies, but at the top are meta-analyses, systematic reviews, and clinical practice guidelines. The issue here is that there is automatically the assumption in looking at this hierarchy of evidence that clinical practice guidelines and meta-analyses are always going to be more trustworthy than a single randomized controlled trial, and that unfortunately isn't always the case. As you can see here, as the hierarchy of evidence evolved and as more and more specialties were using and expecting the use of evidence-based practice, there were definitely pros and cons of the hierarchy of evidence that came to light. From a positive perspective, what the hierarchy of evidence did was create a platform for establishing methods for generating systematic reviews and clinical practice guidelines that are trustworthy, being able to create things like the Cochrane Collaboration Handbook for generating systematic reviews and the Institute of Medicine's 2011 Trustworthiness Guidelines recommendations. Also, in general, because more and more people were looking at research and looking towards critical appraisal and using research to drive practice, it actually created improvements in research methodologies, especially from the perspective of how randomized controlled trials were developed, as well as how systematic reviews were developed to try and improve transparency and improve the literature that decisions were being made off of. However, there were some criticisms of the hierarchy of evidence. First of all, the hierarchy automatically creates this black and white picture where randomized controlled trials are at the top and they're high and everything else is just low. And randomized controlled trials aren't always plausible. Whether it's based on the research question, for example, prognosis studies can't be randomized, or the ethics of the population. For example, you can't randomize people to get or not get a certain diet for their life. Those criticisms, those pitfalls of randomized controlled trials became more and more prevalent as hierarchies were being used more and more. Additionally, well-designed observational studies if they're very well designed and highly populated studies, can really provide not just good information from a statistical standpoint, but can also be more like the real world and make it easier for translating research into practice. So that's what brings us to our third step. In looking at the final step and the kind of where we are currently in the evolution of EBP, we're really at a point where the pitfalls of RCTs are becoming more and more noticeable, and people are more and more attuned to the fact that the hierarchy of evidence does kind of have some pros and some cons. There's been kind of a transition to the idea of looking at evidence from a quality of evidence perspective, and one of the biggest tools in use now to do that is the grade criteria, and it was established as a new approach to look at how to assess evidence, and its GRADE stands for the grade of recommendation, assessment, development, and education. And the purpose of GRADE and the GRADE network in general is to create a platform where you don't look at individual studies, but you look at a body of evidence. And as you can see here, when you're looking at the way that GRADE assesses literature, it does still incorporate the hierarchy of evidence. Randomized controlled trials still start high, and observational studies still start low. But what they have done is be able to account for the fact that there are additional factors that come into play that can lower or higher the quality of evidence based on initial study design. For example, you can lower the quality of a randomized controlled trial based on 5 different factors. The first factor is study limitations, so looking at the biases that exist in the body of literature. Also looking at factors like inconsistency in the research methods, the research population, and the research findings. Also looking at indirectness from the perspective of how well the body of evidence addresses the questions that are being posed to the literature. And Emily's going to speak a little more about how those questions are posed shortly when she discusses PICO. Then there are factors like imprecision, so how big the confidence intervals are in the research findings, how often things are for or against an intervention in the literature. If there is a lot of imprecision in a body of randomized controlled trials, you might not be able to trust the findings or the decisions you can make based on that body of literature quite as much as you could if it all kind of fell in line very tightly. And finally, publication bias. When you're looking at studies, especially randomized controlled trials, you need to be cognizant of the fact that there is a lot of literature that is funded that isn't published. And if you see a body of literature that falls in line very closely all the time, you have to then do a little bit more digging and find out whether publication bias might be a factor that is making it look so clean. And then there's ways that you can raise the quality of evidence. When you're looking at observational studies and looking to see, is there a way or enough of an effect that I can maybe raise it to moderate or even make a body of observational research high quality? It's really related most of the time to the size of the effect. When you're looking at a body of observational studies that finds large or very large effects, then you can trust that literature, those findings, a lot more. So what the GRADE network, what the GRADE criteria does is allow you to actually account for that and raise the quality of evidence for observational studies, whereas that wasn't an option in the hierarchy of evidence. Additionally, GRADE's been around since 2004, but in the past few years, it's gained even more traction. Currently, it's being used by over 100 different organizations in 19 different countries. And both UpToDate and Dynamed are in the process of transitioning their pre-processed content to use the GRADE criteria as a component of the products that they release. So why does this all matter? It's important that we look at evidence-based practice and the evolution of evidence-based practice and where we are today from an evidence-based practice standpoint, because EBP is improving care. When looking at the quality of care, there are specific evidence-based care bundles that have been proven through the literature to improve the quality of care. Sepsis is one of those examples. The Surviving Sepsis campaign has 2 evidence-based care bundles that they recommend that research has proven to decrease mortality and length of stay when these tools are used. And to kind of expand on that, with sepsis, these care bundles have also resulted in cost savings, because the goal of these sepsis bundles is to decrease the likelihood that a patient's going to go from sepsis to septic shock. And when you minimize that happening, then you're also minimizing the need for additional interventions like ICU stays, mechanical ventilation, and dialysis. So in creating and using care bundles that improve quality, you're also creating cost savings, especially in the example of sepsis. Since care bundles have been successful, they've also implemented certain care bundles that have been used specifically to improve safety and to prevent hospital-acquired infection. The central line maintenance bundles that have been developed are one perfect example of that. The use and auditing of central line maintenance bundles have been proven to show time and time again lower infection rates and less chance of needing to replace central lines. So when we think about the future of evidence-based practice, it's important to note that there was a EBP manifesto that was released last year by Dr. Carl Hennigan and his colleagues at the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford. And they were really looking towards the future and kind of looking at what the priorities for EBP should be going forward. And they noted that the need to expand the role of patients, health professionals, and policymakers in research, increase the systematic use of existing evidence, make research evidence relevant, replicable, and accessible to end users, and then to reduce questionable research practices, biases, and conflicts of interest. And if you think about it, there is a perfect positioning for medical librarians to be a part of the future of EBP at even a larger scale than now, simply because some of these things directly play to your strengths. A few more of those notations from the manifesto is that they're looking to produce better usable clinical guidelines, support innovation, quality improvement and safety through the better use of real-world data, educate professional policymakers and the public in evidence-based healthcare to make an informed choice, and encourage leaders in evidence-based medicine. And again, medical librarians are right there on the cusp of all of these, of a lot of these things and being able to help. So now I'm going to pass it off to Emily so that she can talk a little bit more in depth about the role of librarians.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the role of the librarian in teaching, practicing, and supporting evidence-based practice. The librarian's role has evolved over time from merely supportive to a more collaborative role, and even leading the EBP charge in some cases. There are roles for librarians in EBP education, clinical support, and research and dissemination. Librarians are heavily involved in evidence-based practice instruction to students, staff, residents, and faculty, as well as the assessment of EBP skills. Academic librarians are embedded in curricular classes and also serve on curriculum committees where they can lend their expertise in education, planning, assessment, and curriculum mapping. Librarians also have a huge impact working with residents, and I'm sure many of you do this. This includes doing quick literature reviews during morning report, teaching EBM concepts at noon conference or academic half days, teaching appraisal skills during journal clubs, guiding residents through their quality improvement projects, and so much more. Nurses also have a great need for evidence-based education and application. Librarians at magnet hospitals help guide nurses through EBP projects in the nurse residency programs. And at all the hospitals, there are opportunities for librarians to partner with clinical faculty to teach EBP courses that may result in an updated hospital policy or a clinical decision support tool for the electronic health record. Increasingly, librarians are formalizing the use of evidence even in our own practice through evidence-based library and information practice. I think the most exciting way that librarians are involved in evidence-based practice is through clinical support, because we can see immediate and meaningful impact on patient care. Librarians round with clinical teams, answering questions at the point of care, and are seen as an equal member on that interprofessional team. Librarians are also involved in doing literature reviews for the development of hospital guidelines, clinical decision support tools, and evidence briefs. We serve on a wide variety of committees, including shared governance committees at magnet hospitals, EBP advisory committees, and any other committees related to quality, patient safety, and evidence-based practice. Also, increasingly, we see that librarians are involved in evidence-based practice when it relates to patient education. And so we've actually seen not only just providing patients with evidence-based medicine, but actually educating the patients themselves on evidence-based practice and how to find that information themselves. Librarians also have a role, and I think a responsibility, in ensuring that evidence-based work is properly documented and disseminated. This includes registering protocols in Prospero, co-authoring guidelines, systematic reviews, and other publication types, and disseminating that work through publications and conferences. We also have the opportunity to educate faculty on scholarly communication, institutional repositories, and also other issues as well. So over the years, MUSC has actually taught a variety of EBP courses to hospital clinicians at our institution. And so I just wanted to show this as an example because it's something that you can do at your own institution. So we've just developed a course that's open to all faculty, and they develop a question that is relevant to them. They decide if they want to update a nursing policy, if they want to create an order set for the EHR, or any other tool that may be relevant to that question. And we guide them through this course. It's online and in person, so it's a mixed course. We grant CE credit for those who complete all the coursework, and also lunch is sponsored by the quality department, which also, for those in-person sessions, makes it easy and relevant for them to get to class, but for the times they can't get to class, they can do their coursework online. So we've had really great success, and I think this really changes the culture of evidence-based practice at an institution. The more people that you can educate and then actually they can get a measurable result from that, I think the better the impact. So we just kind of want to pause for a minute and take a break and hand this over to you all, because we want to know what roles are you aware of or are you involved in related to evidence-based practice at your institution. So if you all just want to jot a few things down in the chat just so that we can read it, we'll read a few out loud, and then we'll continue on. So how are you involved in evidence-based practice, either roles that we've covered or roles that we haven't covered? So I see EBP Council for Nursing, VA Teaching, EBP, Magnet Journey, Nursing Research, Evidence to Support Device Approval. Oh, that's a good one. Post-marketing surveillance, information literacy, residency, EBP education, shared governance, protocol literature search. So even something as simple as recommending the more evidence-based resources and maybe steering them away from ones that aren't as evidence-based. So teaching ways to disseminate their evidence-based work. Patient care instructors. Yep, so that was the new one that we've stumbled upon. Translation of research to the bedside. So, yeah, thank you all. So this is just so helpful because we see that we're all doing similar types of things at our own institutions, whether we're at a hospital, undergraduate university perhaps, or standalone medical university, wherever we are, there's always a place for us in order to incorporate evidence into instruction and practice. Okay. So when we think about librarians, we really are a value-added resource, and I think it's important for us to promote ourselves as such. And so Amanda and I kind of developed this analogy of librarians' involvement in evidence-based practice as kind of like a realtor's involvement in buying a house. Yes, you can practice evidence-based medicine, evidence-based nursing without a librarian, but we suggest you not do that. And so we want you all to promote that message when you're talking to your faculty and clinicians and students. So we are the expert librarian. We have expertise in searching and collaboration, just like the realtor is the expert in contracts and neighborhoods, housing trends, things like that. We have access to and proficiency in searching library databases, which is similar to that realtor database. So without a realtor, you can't get in, you can only get into Zillow and the free ones, but you can't get into that MLS database. Also, we're the liaison between interprofessional faculty and departments. So we work with so many different professions, and we really know what projects are going on across the university, and so we can connect people and let people know about other faculty at their institutions that may be working on similar projects. And also, we're objective. So a realtor is objective. They're bound to act in the client's best interest, and we're also objective. So I think we've all been in the scenario where, you know, clinician will come to you and they say, okay, well, I want evidence to support this intervention or this point of view. And that's not the way librarians go about things. So we do a comprehensive, very expert-driven literature review, and we can present those results in an unbiased way. And that's the way that Amanda and I work together. I'll do the literature review and do an initial culling of the literature, and then she'll go through it all and very objectively be able to put all of the evidence into the grade table and then pull all the clinical faculty together and say, hey, this is the evidence that we've developed or that we've compiled, and then they can lend their expertise and clinical expertise and also their patient values and knowledge of that in order to come up with a recommendation. So there are 5 steps in the evidence-based practice process, and today's webinar will just go over the first one, which is asking the question. So that's step 1, is to ask the question, and the PICO tool is used to formulate a searchable clinical question, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in just a few minutes. Step 2 is to find the best evidence. You must be able to identify the best database for your question topic and develop an effective and comprehensive search strategy. Step 3 is evaluate the evidence based on validity and importance. Step 4 is apply the information to the patient. And step 5 is to assess the results and evaluate outcomes based on your measurable outcome of interest. So now Amanda is going to talk about a scenario that we'll use to demo throughout these next 3 webinars.
Perfect. Thank you, Emily. Okay, so here's an example, and it may be something that you have heard about or seen about in the news as well as at your own institutions. But we recently started a project with nursing administration, and we're calling it Mission Burnout Prevention. Essentially what happened is they, during the yearly reviews with staff, in addition to surveys for the year, noted that there was an increase in turnover on many units, as well as an increase in absences and in calling in sick. And there was this was all actually causing impacts on quality indicators like medication errors and patient satisfaction scores. So what they did is they held a series of focus groups with nurses and with nurse leaders to kind of look at and dive deep into what the problems might be to cause this. And they found lots of things like were being brought up regarding work-related stress and exhaustion and being emotionally drained. And what they've done is they kind of lumped these themes all together as burnout. And so once they had done that, what they then did is they started to brainstorm ideas, things that could help to alleviate or prevent burnout in the nurses here. And so what has happened from there is they did a brainstorming session. They came up with multiple ideas like education and external resources and one-on-one mentoring and more counseling-related external resources and things like yoga and relaxation rooms to try and address and prevent burnout in the nurses here at MUSC. And not wanting to reinvent the wheel, that's when they kind of tapped into us in the Value Institute with Emily and I and wanted us to assist them so that they could look at other evidence-based programs at other hospitals and see what works, what hasn't worked, and kind of create a plan of action based on the evidence. And so in looking at their potential ideas, they were really interested in education and in yoga because we have an educational platform for other educational needs throughout the campus, as well as a wellness center that offers free yoga services a few times a month. So now what I'm going to do is pass it back off to Emily, who's going to talk a little more about how we are going to be using the tools with them.
Okay, so once we have a clinical scenario or clinical dilemma, we take that and we turn it into PICO elements. And so PICO is a framework to help us formulate our clinical question, and it also helps us identify keywords to use in our literature search. There are other frameworks like PIO and SPIDER used for qualitative or mixed methods research, but PICO is most commonly used in evidence-based practice. And Dr. Scott Richardson, who developed PICO, actually was telling us a story at the Duke EBM Institute, and he was saying that he had it narrowed down to PICO, which is the 4 elements that you see here, and PAIR, which is basically exposure instead of intervention, and then the alternative instead of comparison, and results instead of outcome. And he was telling us a story about how he was developing this, and he was in the grocery store, and he was debating between PICO and PAIR, and he saw Pico de Gallo on the grocery store shelf and said, you know what, that looks really good, I'm going to go with PICO. So that's the history of PICO. So we have patient, population, and problem, so you just identify who or what you're studying, the intervention, the comparison, and the outcome. So the patient population problem is the first element. And so this is usually the most important aspect of your research question. So you could, for example, you could be focusing on a population with a certain disease or perhaps patients in a certain hospital unit. So you could include details such as age, sex, ethnicity, et cetera, but only include these elements in your PICO if they're essential to your question. So based on our scenario that Amanda just described, I want you to just think about who do you think the patient population is that we're studying? So the next element is intervention. So what intervention are we studying or introducing? What is the proposed new intervention? So it could be comparing a new diagnostic test to the gold standard or measuring the effect of one medication over another. And then the comparison is going to be the current or alternative state. So there's not always going to be a comparison present, or it could be another intervention. It could be standard medical care, placebo, or no comparison at all. And the last element of PICO is the outcome. So this is the outcome that we are measuring. The outcome must be something that is measurable so we can determine the effectiveness of the intervention. For example, if our outcome is burnout, then we must have a standardized way to measure burnout, perhaps with a validated scale. So when we go back to our scenario, our patient population or problem that we're studying is hospital nurses. Our intervention is educational strategies. Our comparison is yoga. And the outcome that we're measuring is burnout. Next, we must identify what type of question that we have. This is going to help us phrase our clinical question in a standardized manner. And then later on, the question type is actually going to help us identify which study design is best suited for our question. So in our scenario, we're trying to determine if educational strategies will prevent burnout. And so we're actually looking at a prevention question. And so the prevention is how to reduce the chance of disease by identifying and modifying risk factors, and how to diagnose early by screening. And now we have how to phrase a clinical question. So it's best practice to phrase our PICO question in a certain way based on the type of question. So we simply have to insert the PICO elements into the appropriate template, and then we have our clinical question. So our clinical question is, for hospital nurses, does the use of educational strategies reduce the future risk of burnout compared with yoga? So when we go back and we think about the process of evidence-based practice, the next step here would be moving on to the second step, which is acquiring the evidence. And so that's what we'll do during our next webinar. We're going to take this clinical question, and we'll talk about how to search for evidence. And then in the next one, Amanda will talk about appraisal. So here's the two upcoming webinars. December 11th, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about EBP searching and resources to use. And then Amanda will talk about the appraisal and application of evidence and evidence-based practice in December. So here's our references, and this is available. Tony is going to send out the PDF of this slide deck. And now we have time to open it up to some questions.
Thanks for a great presentation, Emily and Amanda. Does anyone have any questions that you would like to ask either one of them right now? I'll give it a few moments, and we'll see if there are any questions that come through.
Okay.
And while we wait, I am going to take over presenter mode.
Okay. And I know we went over thousands of years of evidence-based practice in 45 minutes, so I know it's a lot of content, but we basically just wanted to lay down the framework before we get into the really hard part, which is the searching and appraisal.
Yes. Louisa asks, do you use a specific software to put evidence in a grade table or in the grade table?
We use two different methodologies. For therapy questions and for diagnosis questions, you can use Grade Pro, which is a software that's put out by the grade working group. And if you're using it for academic or non-commercial practices, it's actually free for use. and there's lots of resources that are released by the Grade Working Network that can help, the Grade Working Group that can help with how to use the tool. We also use grade criteria in a qualitative format as well. And there are some recent publications about how to use grade qualitatively as well, when especially when you're looking at literature that isn't necessarily therapy or diagnosis related.
Okay. Jules asks, can you tell me where you found the pastel levels of evidence triangle? It's a good job explaining why the levels are where they are in a pyramid, and I would like to use it.
Absolutely. Are you referencing the one that includes the clinical practice guidelines at the top, or the one by itself where the RCTs are at the top? Because they're from two different sources. The one that has clinical practice guidelines at the top is actually from Wikipedia.
Oh, it's the one that says where clinical trials are at the top.
Yeah, clinical practice guidelines where clinical trials are at the top. That actually was in a recent publication, and it's in our reference list. Hold on, I'll tell you exactly which one. It was, sorry, it was in the very top one, Progress in Evidence-Based Medicine a Quarter Century On. That's where the one with RCTs at the top is from. You're very welcome.
Morgan asks, what about the glut of pharma-supported systematic reviews?
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, I mean, this kind of goes into biases, you know, and basically we do the best we can. So we work with the evidence that we have, and we can look at gray literature to kind of, you know, tease out some of that and kind of get a more objective, holistic view. I don't know if you want to speak to that. And
in addition, when it comes to clinical practice guidelines, we also use the University of Pennsylvania's Trustworthiness Guideline Rating Scale, which talks a lot about how to look at clinical practice guidelines from a potential conflict of interest perspective. And so what I've kind of started to do is kind of take those points of interest from the Trustworthiness Guideline Rating Scale and apply them when it comes to looking at systematic reviews as well, because more and more looking at potential conflicts of interest for all different types of research has become important because there's so much being published.
Yeah.
Okay. Pamela asks, would you always use all PICO elements when doing the actual database search?
I usually don't use every single element, so it just depends on the question, but it depends on like what I deem the most important to be in the literature. So oftentimes I might look at the problem, like a disease state and an intervention and maybe a comparison, and then leave out the outcome, because oftentimes the outcome may not be listed in the abstract or the mesh heading. So if you use all the PICO elements, your search will be a little too narrow. And we'll talk more about that in the next webinar, which is searching and how to identify, based on the literature that you're finding, how to kind of rework those PICO elements and synonyms and keywords and things like that.
Great. Stacy says, I often find that when teaching students how to formulate a PICO question, students get confused between EBP questions and quality improvement, process improvement questions, and try to fit a QI question into an EPP design. Do you have any resources to help students distinguish or differentiate QI from EBP?
It's interesting that you ask that because one of the things we've done in the Value Institute is actually figure out a way to merge the quality improvement methodology of DMAIC with evidence-based practice so that it makes it a little easier to integrate those two things when it is a clinically based question. If it's strictly a quality improvement question, a lot of times what we end up doing is it's kind of picking and choosing the tools we use from the host of tools accessible both through more quality improvement, process improvement avenues as well as evidence-based practice. So sometimes we end up being able to kind of pick and choose which tools would best fit that project. One resource I would think that you could use to help distinguish and differentiate would be to look at the resources on the Institute for Healthcare Improvements website, because they do a pretty good job of kind of showing how the two are different, but also how the two are similar.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that resource, so that really helps me out too.
Perfect.
Are there any other questions that you might have for Emily and Amanda? What was the name of that institute again?
It is actually in the references.
Oh,
the
sorry,
Institute
I'll go back to the references.
And then there's the website.
The fourth one down.
Did that work? Okay. Let's see. Anything recommended to get ready for next webinar session in December?
Nope, just come as you are, and we'll go through the whole searching together. So it'll be like a working meeting. You can bring your laptops and search with me if you want.
Oh, that'll be exciting. They can try between PubMed and PubMed 2.0.
Really?
No, not really, no. It wouldn't take
I thought you were trying to announce something.
No. Let's see. Will you send out a recording of this session? Oh, and that leads me to the next thing then. So, as a reminder, today's presentation will be available on the NLM YouTube channel as soon as possible. I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, and if you visit YouTube and search NNLM, you should see our channel page in the search results. And I'm going to paste into the chat box the NNLM YouTube channel as well. Additionally, Emily and Amanda has agreed to share their presentation slides following the webinar. So I will send out a PDF of the slides as soon as I can get the webinar available on YouTube. So you will receive an email since you have pre-registered for it, a link to the YouTube channel, recording, as well as the PDF slides as well. As a reminder, as Emily had mentioned before, Part 2 of an Introduction to Evidence-Based Practice, a Librarian's Guide, is scheduled on Tuesday, December 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll cover searching. Pre-registration is required, so even if you registered for Part 1, it does not necessarily mean that you are registered for Part 2. So you'll need to go back to the class page and register for Part 2 on searching. Additionally, NNLM invites you to attend the Seaside webinar we have scheduled this Thursday at 2 p.m. called Getting Off the Ground with Graphic Medicine with Alice Jagers, Matthew No, and Rachel Sanderson. And I will paste that into the chat box as well if that is something you are interested in. And lastly, to evaluate today's webinar and receive your MLA CE certification, please visit the following link. And let me go ahead and post that into the chat box as well. After you've completed the evaluation, you'll receive instructions on how to claim MLA CE credit through the MedLibEd website. Again, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, and thank you both, Emily and Amanda, for the presentation today. I really appreciated some of those new resources that I needed a refresher on too, actually. So thanks everyone, and have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.